So I've done a real variety of graphic novels. I first started out doing like nonfiction books. This book, Lab USA, is definitely for adults. It's kind of like a human rights X-Files kind of mashup. But my first graphic novel, the three books across the top are all books that were done for Henry Holt for young readers. So they're aimed at kind of 9 and up. They're boy stories for the most part. And kind of like Lab USA, in the recent years, I've kind of been doing more activist comic books, which I'll talk about a little bit, but I'm going to pretty much focus on the books for kids. But I thought what might be helpful is to just talk about the different storytelling tools that I think are really helpful. One is like word and picture interactions is something to really look at. Style as a narrative tool, which I think Julie was talking about a little bit with her idea of the fantasy panels and then the other panels. Color as a narrative tool, which we were just talking about a bit, and panel design, and then non-textual images in like nonfiction. Because some of my my last book for kids, Bad for You, but also my activist comics are nonfiction comics, and there's some elements to that which are really good from a teaching angle. Okay, so let's take a look at these. So word and picture interactions. So something I really talk about when I teach is how words and pictures together create meanings. So for instance, I can ask somebody here, which one of these does he look like he's really sorry? Now I can't see the chat anymore, but
I can see the chat. So if we say one, if we say the far left is 1 and the far right is 5, so which ones do you think he looks like he's really sorry in?
Like he's sincerely sorry. I
So
see.
2 votes for 5, 2 votes for 3.
Both of which are correct. And so of course here it's because his facial emotion matches his words. But there's one here that we're used to seeing on people's face when they say they're sorry. In fact, probably more often than a sincere apology. Which apology looks really familiar?
I would say number 1 looks familiar.
Especially if you're married. If you're married or you have a little brother or sister, as I say to the kids, number 1 is really familiar. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the words, like the words "I'm sorry," are kind of neutral. In a way, we know what the meaning is, but it's modified by the face. You know, the picture is going to change the meaning of the words. And this is really the heart of like word balloons is, and I think if you're going to teach graphic novels, it's really fun just to show the kids the different word balloons and talk about how, you know, the words in them are what people say, but the shape around them are how people say it. And so in comics, it's always like, what's the picture telling you and what's the words telling you? And that's also a good way to talk to kids about graphic novels is be like, okay, so if you just read the words, what are you getting here? But what more information are you getting from the pictures? Because if a graphic novel is done well, you're going to get more information from the pictures. I know both Eric and I hold out this same example of the Shakespeare adaptations of graphic adaptations of Macbeth and Hamlet, where you have pages and pages of just people talking to each other. 2 people on the panel talking to each other, and there's the pictures give you nothing extra. You know, a good graphic novel, the image is going to give you something more to add more meaning. So let's see. I have to remember why. So we're talking about. Okay, so and another aspect of this is also how you have those 2 different boxes. You know, you've got the word balloons, but then getting kids to identify where the narrator's voice is. And, you know, in a scene like this, you have this idea where, okay, we know the live action is the people talking to each other, but then in that lower panel, for instance, because I've kind of lost my cursor, but that lower panel where it says, that's the hardware store, we know that that's the voice of the narrator. And so getting kids to also look at the difference of, well, what does it mean when a picture's when the words are in a box versus what does it mean when it's in a word balloon. And you can talk about dialogue. You can talk about how the different word balloons change the feeling of the dialogue, but also like, what does it mean when that panel on the bottom tier gets a little wavy? What do we know is happening there? You know? And so that panel design is giving you a little bit of an indication that we're going back in a memory. So then when you look at the top of the page, on the next page, you realize that this is, you know, if you can hold on to it, that it's a memory, and he's thinking, and the thoughts in the caption box, the box across the top, are his present thoughts about what you're seeing in the picture. So this happens a lot in graphic novels, where the box, the caption box, is the narrator in present time remembering something, while the pictures are essentially a memory. And so that's really interesting, I think, as a tool that you can like separate those two things. You know, you can be in both times at once. So that's where like word picture interactions get pretty complex. Now, related to this is this idea. This is another example. This is from Blindspot. This other one was from Take What You Can Carry, but this one is from Blindspot. And this was a point near the end of the book, which I would consider the character's epiphany. And he's sort of out in the woods, and he's looking up at the stars, and we're completely in his thoughts. And this is a point where the author, myself, decided, I want the words to have more power than the pictures in some ways. So he's looking at the stars, and he's describing looking at the stars, and it sort of fades to black as he falls asleep. And so as the author, I'm getting the reader's attention completely on the words, because this is where the language is more lyrical and everything like that. So that's also something to talk about, these idea of where's the author putting your attention? Like, what do you think the author really wants you to pay attention to in this picture? Now, this idea of word and picture interaction really comes through in this graphic novel. It's called Take What You Can Carry. And it's two stories that happen in two different periods. One is a fairly contemporary story. The one done in blue is like a 12-year-old boy who's like caught shoplifting and ends up working for a store owner. Whereas the other one, this more sepia colored one, is takes place in a Japanese internment camp. And Eric and I were talking about this at a previous kind of comic, or the podcast that you did, is that in doing this book, I ended up deciding to make the choice to make the internment story as wordless. And one of the main reasons I did this is because it functions in the story as a memory. And so I wanted to set it apart somewhere with the voice, but also I have to be honest that as privileged white male in my 40s when I wrote this book, I wasn't all that sure about how comfortable I was with the choices I would make writing in an Asian, a 12-year-old boy who was interned in a Japanese internment camp. I wanted to show his life experiences, but I didn't feel like I wanted to make those missteps, or make any presumptions. Even though I read several books about it, I didn't want to make any presumptions about how this character would feel about that environment, because it was a whole range of responses, actually, from what I read. But anyway, I do have a few panels here in a way just to get across this idea of how a wordless comic can feel a little more cinematic. So this is actually how the book opens.
And Kevin, are these, you're just showing us the panels, but are these all like on like several panels on a 2-page spread kind of situation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll show you the full pages in a minute. So the choice here was really just to give you some sort of, that's what we call in comics an establishing shot, which is also something worth talking about, is the idea that oftentimes in comics, you establish a scene through a big panel, or you work your way into it. In this case, I chose to do an establishing shot as basically a series of pages. I kind of dragged it out because it all takes place in this internment camp. And so it's kind of like trying to introduce the reader to it in this kind of cinematic way. And I think it gives, you know, it starts out really large and then gets in closer and closer. So you start to maybe identify with this one vulnerable human in this giant space. So I was trying to get this idea of vulnerability and like, you know, what is this one kid's experience in this huge system? And then get a few more details. And then this was actually a double page spread that had the title on it of the book.
Oh, nice.
But anyway, that reads a certain way. Whereas the other panels in the shoplifting story, are more traditional panels. They break up, you know, and there's got plenty of dialogue and things like that. So we talked a minute ago about this idea of color as part of the narrative, and this is obviously really works in this story as well, because as you can see right on the cover, the two stories alternate chapter to chapter, and so all the internment stories are in this sepia style, which is also another way to do narrative, is a slightly different style. You know, it's colored with watercolor overlays as opposed to this kind of more clean digital style. But those two colors are also really obviously indicates to the reader very quickly that they're in two different narrative spaces. So that's another type of question you can read. You can ask the, you know, well, why did the author do two different colors, you know? And that gets the kids thinking more deeply about how color might play a role. So I guess we'll get back to color in a minute because I wasn't sure how I arranged this. So style is narrative. These are also done in two different styles. Now, Blindspot was a story about kids playing Army in the Woods, and kind of like what Julie did, there's fantasy sequences of it. And so when it was a fantasy, when they were in the character's imagination, I drew it as like a Sergeant Rock era 1970s comic, Army comic, which you can see here, these different styles. So again, the style shifts. And so the style becomes a way to mark when you're in the character's imagination. And so that's another question you ask. So why is what does it mean when the style changes? You could ask your students that. A great, the best practitioner of this is Calvin and Hobbes. Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes is like all about this, you know. It's really about building the idea of a fantasy character, a fantasy life that a character has versus a reality, you know. And so you can show that in style. And in the book, it becomes pretty important because, so this book is basically about kids playing Army in the Woods. And at one point, their Army game sort of crosses the line, because the subtext of the book is also kind of about how young kids, boys in particular, have to sort of come to terms with violence. Because, you know, you grow up with a lot of fantasy violence, and then inevitably you might experience some sort of violence in your life or become aware of how serious it is. So in this case, this is a story of these kids. They end up kind of in this fantasy, they end up breaking down this man's sort of homeless shack. And so it's represented as like kind of a classic, Vietnam firefight kind of scene. And then, as Julie did with her panel construction for a big dramatic panel, I'll show that later. That's in the next part. But anyway, as you can see, the two styles here are contrasted to show you that they're really into this fantasy, this scene. And we'll talk a little bit more about this scene later. Another part of the book is where the young character, through his interest in World War II, discovers pictures of the Holocaust, which is, you know, kind of akin to when kids come across stuff on the internet nowadays. And so I decided for this that a photorealistic style would really indicate that this is reality, you know, that this has that stark reality of a photograph. And, you know, it's like evidence or something along those lines. So this same idea plays out in the color. The color is narrative. In this story, this kid at one point goes to like a child psychologist. So those parts, the school that he's in and the child psychologist are these cold institutional colors, Whereas, as you saw before, the woods are this kind of warm green. Later in the book, there's a main scene that happens on Halloween night and in the fall. So the book actually follows the seasons. It starts out in the summer, or it starts out in the spring, and the summer are in this green, and then it goes into the fall, and the more reflective parts of the book are in the winter when he's kind of reflecting about this experience he had. So, so in another book, Catman, I used color a lot for a narrative too, because this story is about a kid who sort of starts feeding stray cats just out of boredom. And there's this girl who really likes to draw manga comics or anime comics. And so she creates this character called Catman. And so when we first see the Catman character, it's done in this red to make it kind of stick out. And the way this story is constructed color-wise is that it's kind of grays in the beginning. And as the action happens and his own life becomes a little more passionate and heroic in relationship to her fantasy idea of him as Catman, the reds become more saturated and more prominent. And so kind of like Julie did in her book, there are intercut between the chapters are these sort of like anime versions of what's happening. They're kind of metaphors, or they're kind of like symbolic things of what the action is. And so slowly over time, the real world starts to match this fantasy world as he kind of comes out of his shell and takes on more things. So that color, so that's another thing where the color can really play a role in the narrative and communicating that narrative. Then this other idea, panel design is a narrative tool. This is kind of akin to what Julie did with her. She showed that character moving through space by splitting up the space. This is a comic. This is by the artist Seth, who does comics for adults. I mentioned I see some chat numbers are popping up there. So I don't know if there's any, if we want to stop and see if there's anything that.
Now people are they were commenting on that the cat looked feral. And that Minsun is now saying it's powerful use of color. I think.
Oh, okay, thank you. So somebody could look at this and tell me, this really clever panel design, what does this tell us about how comics work? Because it's actually pretty smart what he's showing us. He's showing us something about how do we depict time in comics? I mean, maybe that's too abstract a question, but. Or here's another question.
Yeah, so I think Kevin's not being rhetorical here, right? So I think it's an invitation for people to comment on what Seth, who's an artist that I quite like as well, what is Seth doing here with this page in terms of time?
Well, I think for me, as the panels go forward, it seems as if the memory is becoming more clear, and I don't know if that's right, and that's just the sense that I get from looking at it.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned memories, because Seth's comics are very nostalgic and they're very much about characters revisiting old places and all of that. So there's definitely a vibe of memory going on there, which is pretty subtle. When we think about it, is this 6 different characters?
Right. It's like one scene, one landscape that he broke down. He separated it into 6 panels so that you can see that single character explore each area, and it lets the reader take the time with the character in each panel, rather than if you just had like one panel and maybe the guy walking around with a dotted line or something like that, you'd probably gloss over it. But by separating it into 6 panels, you give each panel its moment and sort of be there with that character in that moment, looking at that place.
Yeah. I think it has a really interesting effect, and I guess in some ways I show it because I show it to show what panels can do. I mean, they can. In some ways, what he's highlighting is the fact that panels represent moments in time. And that seems really obvious because it's a sequential medium, but I just think this is a really clever way to do it. Maybe Eric has an analysis of it that's...
No, I mean, I agree, although I'm a bit distracted now because of what Julie was saying about the lines. In my head now, I have Billy from Family Circus.
I know, right? Well, sometimes I do that in my own, but it depends on what I'm trying to do. This I think, because the dotted line gives more of a sense of motion, and what you have with this is a little bit more of a sense of taking a pause in each moment.
Yeah.
So it's slower.
I mean, so much of Seth is about status, like statis rather than us, right? Like his characters are just like in this static existence where they're not moving forward. They're kind of stuck in a memory. They're stuck in a place in the past. And so here's a character who's literally, he has 6 panels to move around, but he doesn't really go anywhere, right? He's like, he's just in this one space, and mentally that's just where he is, right? I mean, it's very existential or sort of Godot-like, right?
I guess it is.
Waiting.
And you know, 12-year-olds get just as confused when I ask them the same question. It's really interesting because they get excited. Oh, it's all one landscape, and it makes you realize that a panel, you're making all these choices of what you get to show and what you don't get to show.
Yeah.
So back to this. Obviously, I've made certain choices with like all these angled panels, as Julie mentioned. Like putting all those angles in there is going to imply lots of action and things like that. These bleeds off the edges in the first page is going to make it feel more immersive and more in the situation. So as I mentioned before, these are the panels where they start to destroy this guy's house, and then and you've set up this idea that the style represents the imagination. Well, this is a big double page spread, and this is the moment where the character realizes that this fantasy violence has gone way too far. And so this is the only place in the book where these two styles are together in a panel. And it's a big double page. It's the only double page spread in the whole book.
Wow.
This and the one that we saw where he's looking up the stars, which actually doesn't count as a double page spread because it's actually a bunch of panels. So this is it. This is the one big double page spread. So that's where panel design creates drama, you know? And so you can ask your readers, well, why is this 2 pages across? And then you can say, well, if it's so important, why is it important? So what makes this scene so important? And then they start to read through the details, etc. Now this is another part of the book where the boy sort of gets pulled into a schoolyard fight. Now this is one of those things where it's just kind of like the artist enjoys doing some clever design. The fight takes place under these sort of jungle gym that a lot of us grew up with, where these two things cross. And so the panel structure follows that. You know, the panel structure, and by closely cropping, it makes you feel sort of hemmed in. But again, like artists do this all the time, where and if you guys start to teach graphic novels, if you really look closely at panel structure, you'll see how many times artists really play around with that. And this is just another example of that. There's another scene where he's running through the woods, and it gives this implication of, you know, by breaking down the panels and using black as the panels, then it feels more chaotic. It feels more like a dream or more like a panic or something like that. Now, one of the things that is sometimes difficult to figure out as an artist is how do you show like a large period of time. And like in Catman, one of the things that the character does is he feeds stray cats over a long period of time. And it took me a long time to figure out, well, how am I going to show this? Like this, how do I get across this feeling of time passing? And I'm not sure why this works, but it ended up sort of working. It's like by putting them in these circles and showing maybe a weather changing or close-ups, it indicates somehow, it somehow indicates to me at least that a long period of time has passed, you know? And so you might ask students like that, you know, so you look for these different, I guess I'd call them panel anomalies in whatever book you're teaching and see what the author might be intending. I did this again in, and maybe it was a little bit of an homage to Seth. I did this in Take What You Can Carry, because a big plot point of the story is that the boy starts working. He steals from this store and he starts working in the store. And so again, I had to sort of show a period of time happening over a period, you know, you know that that's not his twin brother also painting the parking lot. You make the assumption that this is like multiple activities happening over time. So again, panel structure is like lots of opportunities for the artist to explore. And so as a teacher, it's usually a pretty rich area for analysis. And then the last one, which you see a lot in nonfiction books, is non-textual elements. I think is actually like a pedagogical term that someone who wrote a study guide about one of my comics told me. So non-textual elements is like things like charts and other ways of presenting information. Now you do see it in comics, in fiction comics. I actually really like the use of a map. And so in Blindspot, basically every scene takes place in the woods except for a couple. And so by putting a map in the beginning of the book, it's just an additional reader interest. And then the reader can give a whole sort of oversight of the book. And it's a great thing also just to analyze and look at and go back to later. In fact, the footsteps in the map actually follow the action of the book. But where you see it a lot is in nonfiction graphic novels. These activist comics I do, like this one is about wage theft, which is about people who go work for other people and they don't get paid their wages. This was for a worker center down in Houston. And so one thing in the middle that we had the challenge of like, how do you find a path to justice? And so we used this thing, we used a board game, for instance. But a board game is a really interesting thing that I've come back to a few times as an illustrator, because I also work as an illustrator. It's a great way to tell a story in a different type of format. And graphic novels have a lot of those. If you start to look at nonfiction graphic novels about things like evolution or climate change or whatever, this is another really good entry point into the information. Because kids can kind of understand, some kids definitely understand things through these spatial relationships that they wouldn't get just reading a bunch of text, which is why infographics, I think, have become so popular. Now, Bad for You is a book about what we call moral panics. And for instance, there's a map about the comic burnings from 1944 to 55. And there's a section about the fears over texting. So I can use like a cutaway, brain thing and like show the different, it's a different way of organizing information to show how, different fears over digital technology, hooking it up with different parts of the brain. This was about, how insurance ruined the great playgrounds of the 70s, the great dangerous playgrounds of the 70s, which are all gone. And then near the end of the book, there's an updating of the previous map of the comic book burnings about things like zero tolerance, which are like, hyper responses to things like people having toy guns or a kid pointing a chicken finger at a teacher and going bang, bang. And it's actually a surprisingly absurd yet dark history. But anyway, so if you look at nonfiction books, you'll see a lot of these. Nonfiction graphic novels have a lot of non-textual elements. And it's a fun way to then, what you can actually do is then give, you can show a lot of examples of these and then give your students maybe some bit of information and see if they can turn theirs into something like a chart or a map or something like that. The last one I'll show, I did a comic in 2016 about the experience of asylum seekers on the border. And in this one, the really complicated, what happens after you get picked up at the border, the different options if you go to court or if you go straight to a detention center, or if you get sent back, which is a really complicated situation. And so setting up some sort of non-textual element like a flow chart was a way to process that information. So these are just like the things that I think will probably, if you take these ideas and apply them to almost any graphic novel, you're going to get something out of it that you're going to be able to teach your kids or that they're going to be able to find in there. I mean, what I will say, probably the most rare, style as a narrative tool and color as a narrative tool, they're a little more rare. but some of the real classic books do that. Certainly, American Born Chinese does color, does style as a narrative tool. A lot of books play with these. Because graphic novelists are so attuned to what the visuals are doing that they like to play with all these different tools.